Hello. Welcome, everyone. My name is Liz Gerber, and on behalf of Northwestern Center for Human-Computer Interaction and Design, I'd like to welcome our attendees. We're just thrilled to have you today. The goal of our center, based at Northwestern, is to look at new interaction paradigms to support collaborative, sustainable, and equitable society and work. And we've designed these dialogue series to help people connect and engage with meaningful ideas to realize this vision. And today I could not be more thrilled to welcome our colleagues to talk about how AI and how is affecting the way they think about the future of work and the research and applied research they're doing around this area. Let me first I'll introduce them one at a time. And the way we're going to do this is I'll introduce them in a moment. And then what will happen is they'll each present their research for a few minutes, just so we have, and then we'll go right into a conversation. I have some prepared questions, but we'd love to hear from you, the audience. So please add your questions to the Q&A and we will get through as many as we possibly can. So we will be using the chat to share resources as they come up. And this event is being recorded, so we will be able to post it online if you'd like to review it later or share with someone else. I want to thank everybody who made it possible to pull this together, and welcome to all of you for being here. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing Rebecca Hines. She is the Center of the Innovation Lab at Asana, where she looks at the intersection of technology, leadership, and the evolving nature of work. First, we'll have Rebecca, if you're willing to say a few words about what research you do and how you're thinking about AI in the future of research. We'd love to hear the future of work, excuse me. We'd love to hear from you.
Sure, Liz, thank you so much and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rebecca. I lead the Work Innovation Lab at Asana. Asana is a work management platform that helps teams work smarter together and connects the company goals and strategies with the task and execution level. And then the Work Innovation Lab is our internal think tank. So we conduct research with our customers as well as leading experts from all across the world on how we see the world of work evolving and how executives in particular can prepare for some of the changes and challenges that we see associated with work today and work in the future. My research specifically focuses quite heavily on digital technology and how it impacts work. AI is a big focus, but also some older technologies, including collaboration technologies. Right now, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing, organizations can use more than 300 different SaaS tools, and many of those tools are collaboration tools. Many of those tools are disconnected and fragmented. And so we think a lot about how organizations can streamline their technology stacks and minimize some of the context switching that we know is associated with having too many disconnected and fragmented tools. And in many ways, AI adds a lot of promise to solving that problem, but also a lot of complexity. And when it comes to AI, we think a lot about the change management associated with AI and this dichotomy that we're seeing across the board in terms of a lot of optimism, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of confidence in the potential of AI, but also a lot of skepticism and fear and nervousness associated with the technology, especially as we look at more junior folks in the organization and less senior folks in general. And then in terms of the research methods that I use and my team uses, it's pretty mixed. So we use a lot of surveys, especially as we're looking at the changes that we're seeing associated with AI adoption right now. We're running a lot of surveys over time to understand the differences that are playing out pretty rapidly in the context of AI and generative AI at work. We also do experiments in many cases with our customers. We do observational studies, and then we do a lot of research that is based on behavioral data. So a lot of technology exhaust data and looking at what we see from a technology perspective in terms of how individuals are working together in their organizations and using AI to then understand what are some of the helpful interaction patterns that we see associated with great performance, in particular innovation? What do we see the most innovative companies do differently compared to the least innovative companies, specifically related to how their workers and teams are working together through different technologies? So that's a little bit of my research. I'm really passionate about teams in particular. I was a former athlete and have always been fascinated by how groups of people can come together in a way where potentially the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So many questions I have to follow up with on that, but I hope perhaps we'll get there. Next up, we have Melissa Valentine. Thank you so much for being here. She is a professor at Stanford in the Management Science and Engineering Department, but very specifically in a group called the Work Technology and Organization Group, which studies exactly that, work technology and organizing. So thanks so much, Melissa, for being here. We'd love to hear a little from you.
Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad, Liz, that you mentioned the Center for Work Technology and Organization. When I was lucky enough to be hired there about a decade ago, I felt really grateful. The leaders there at the time had really just set an agenda that I was really grateful to be a part of. And I'm really thrilled because some of our illustrious alumni are here today. So Liz is a graduate of our program. Rebecca is actually a graduate from our program. Hatem Rahman, who is a professor at Northwestern, who is in the audience right now, also we're proud of him, I should say. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be here, and yeah, please check out check out WTO. So all right, so I'm excited. I'll tell you about 3 studies, and my impression is that this is intended to generate conversation. So 3 AI studies that I've done recently that I'm interested in talking with folks about. So one was an ethnography of a retail company. What I found really interesting about this study is that the domain experts were reskilled. So it's an example of augmented intelligence rather than replacement with AI. So I have a paper that is with Rebecca where we're looking at what were sort of the design practices of the data scientists that helped accomplish this sort of reskilling, this like augmented intelligence for the experts instead of a replacement or a deskilling. So that's one. The second one is an ethnography of AI development in a hospital ICU. And what's interesting to me about this particular study is the main challenge that we observed was around data annotation. So the project team, which was interdisciplinary, we had doctors and also CS folks, when they tried to create a label set to annotate their data to train the computer vision model, what they discovered is that their original sort of taxonomy of labels didn't work. And over time, over the 3-year period, they had to innovate a new set of labels that they were going to use. So it's an interesting example of how expertise changed through this process of learning how to create a label set that worked on this data set. So that's another thing I'd love to talk about if anyone gets interested in that. And then the final one is studies that are sort of connecting AI with some prior research that I did on flash teams. So flash teams is when like a user can use a platform basically to convene a team. I think what's interesting about this in the context of thinking about AI is there are a lot of decisions that people make to design teams and design organizations. And it's interesting to think about the different data technologies that can support people in designing teams and designing organizations. So there are a lot of different studies that sort of connect into that overall research agenda. All right, excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Melissa. The breadth of your work, I can't wait to dive into it a bit more. Thank you for being here. And finally, we have Dr. Brent Heck. He is coming to us from Microsoft, where he's the Director of Applied Science. And he's really looking at doing some great work, trying to think about how do we integrate, or how do they integrate generative AI into some of Microsoft's products, and also help Microsoft adapt rather to this hybrid work world that we're in. He also is a professor at Northwestern. So Brent, thanks so much for being here. Are you ready to share your thoughts? We can't wait to hear from you.
I am, and thanks, Liz, and sorry, folks, for being late. We had the unusual challenge of getting a Zoom account attached to a Microsoft email, which is a pretty Microsoft specific problem. As you may have heard, we have a related product that encourages us to use Teams more often than Zoom. But I'm here under my Northwestern account, which is much more friendly to the Zoom world. Great to see everyone. I'm very happy to be here discussing this extraordinarily important topic. Squeezing us at I think about AI in the future work all day, every day, and squeezing in my role at Microsoft, I have the blessing to be a part of just so many different research projects to support them and ensure they're successful, and so many different research projects that end up as products that everyone uses. So encourage everyone to take our role in influencing the future extraordinarily seriously. So it's hard to pick what to what to talk about in a small amount of time. So I thought actually what I'd do is I have a walking deck that I use with customers, and internally sort of talk you through just a couple of the key points that I make in that walking deck. The walking deck is called 5 Misconceptions About AI and the Future of Work. I like to meet the audience there. I learned that during the hybrid era, where folks were very curious about hybrid. Let's meet them at things they might think are misconceptions, or things that are ideas that they might have heard about, and they want to know if that's true or not, these types of things. So the 5 misconceptions that I walk through are: the first is that the best use of generative AI at my company is to replace people. That's a misconception, because the economic history of general purpose technologies, like many hypothesized language models is such that you can much more effectively increase your top line, so your overall revenue, if you augment folks. And the effect size of that is much, much greater than the maximum possible effect size you can have by substituting people, because you only can make yourself more profitable by your total labor costs, but you can potentially increase your company's output infinitely. So it's, for folks who are familiar with shorting or longing a stock, it's taking a short or long position, similar dynamic. The second misconception is that generative AI will either dramatically improve productivity at my company right now in capital letters, or it's basically just hype. In this misconception, this section, I walk through how these types of, again, these general purpose technologies tend to unfold across the economy in 2 phases. One is where you use them in existing workflows with existing other technologies, and you get sort of incremental productivity gains. And then people develop complementary technologies and new ways of doing things that really, you see the enormous hockey stick increase in sort of macroeconomic statistics. For instance, a reasonable analogy is the cars. They're great, but they really are great with asphalt. These types of things. The third is that text is the future of computer interfaces, and that one I walk people through a lot of the science on recall versus recognition, which I'm sure many of you are deeply familiar with, and the cognitive tax of evaluating text. I get to be a geography nerd, as many of you know. I have a background in geography, and I have a slide that has a MapQuest instructions, all text, and track up GPS-style navigation, and sort of remind folks how much easier the right hand there is than the left hand, and we're still kind of in the MapQuest era of generative AI. The fourth one is that generative AI is inherently bad for people who make content for a living. This is my most controversial one, and I think it's also by far the most important one. I'd say the current paradigm is really bad, but there's a lot of reasons to expect the current paradigm is not sustainable for any party. And so the question is, what will replace it? There's tremendous market, policy, security, legal pressures for people to develop what you might call clean or compliant or responsible or ethical content supply chains, bolstering a robust content ecosystem that benefits content creators and the language models equally. I'm seeing lots of movement in those directions, lots of exciting stuff happening. And I think there's actually a huge space for the research community to come in and say, here's a different socio-technical framework that we can use that will pass value back to the supply chain, the content supply chain, pass value across the content ecosystem to content creators, such that everyone benefits from generative AI, not only one part of the supply chain. Generative AI systems are this weird thing that eats its own supply chain in that sense, and so it's a pretty unique and interesting thing to study. And then the fifth one is that we can predict the future of work at all. And here's where I walk through all sorts of famous computer scientists talking about their predictions from AI and how horribly wrong we are, and encourage everyone instead to diversify their expectations and plan in a diversified way versus saying the future of work is X. A lot of people in my audience set for this talk are used to hearing futurists, reading very strongly stated articles in the news. And in that one, I sort of encourage folks to say, let's, you're responsible business leaders or responsible leaders here at Microsoft. Let's make sure that we're doing what we do in any uncertain environment, which is diversify and plan. So I think that was how I chose to use my couple minutes. Hopefully, it was useful for discussion.
That was great, Brent. Thank you. And of course, I want Rebecca, Melissa, and Brent, feel free to ask questions of each other. And I'll start with one, though, maybe as you're coming up with them, which is you referenced, Brent, referenced MapQuest. And I still find printed directions at my mother's house of, how to get to certain difficult places printed for MapQuest. And it made me wonder how you've all been in this field for almost a decade now. And I'm curious how you've seen, do you agree with Brent that we're in the MapQuest stage? And if not, how have you seen the field change over the last 10 years? What kind of questions were we asking 10 years ago? And how is that different from what we're asking now?
I could take a first stab.
Sure.
Yeah. So with respect to the MapQuest stuff, actually, Liz, I actually say like one observation I have, having been in the academic world for a long time and now at the industry world for a decent period of time as well, is that a lot of the research questions that academics asked 10 to 15 years ago are as important as maybe we thought they would be. So with respect to recall versus recognition, that's super old. It's still incredibly important, and comes up and is super useful. Business leaders here, and other folks I talk to still find it very useful.
Can you expand upon what that means, recall?
Sure. Yeah. So there's the basic idea that cognitively, the human brain has not changed all that much in the last 10 to 15 years, at least. And there might be some neuroscientists around who would disagree with me there, but at least functionally at the level that I tend to interact with. It's much easier for us to recognize things that we want than to recall them. So the famous, it's a key reason why we switched from command line to GUIs, is that like you had to remember, oh yeah, how do I open a file again? Like what's the name of that program again? These types of things. And we're a little bit in that, more than a little bit, we're in that space with these pure, command line based interfaces. Once again, they're more flexible than they were in the DOS era. But the core idea is like, I'm looking at this prompt, what do I want to do? And whereas if you have GUI or graphical suggestions, these type of things that can help you get things going. So that's still relevant and still matters. Another question that people asked around MapQuest was like, would it make us less capable at doing navigation? Because we aren't doing all that spatial rotation in our heads. And the best research suggests, yes, actually, we are worse at doing spatial rotation. And that does have externalities, but the benefits of being able to rely on a system to navigate us from point A to point B. Just imagine when you're traveling next time, like think about trying to travel without Apple Maps or Google Maps or, these types of things and how much that empowers you. Yeah, you gave up some spatial rotation skills, but you have that, and it's generally been a good bet across human history to distribute one's cognition that way. But it's a really good question to ask because over time maybe it won't be.
So Melissa, I know you used to study teams and safety and trust within teams, and I may be wrong, but I don't think was there a lot of technology involved at that time, or were you mostly looking at person-person interaction?
Well, yeah. So the question of like how have the questions changed over the last 10 years? I actually teach a class on future of work at Stanford, and so I can think of the way that class has evolved over the last 10 years. And as you're noting, my background, so my PhD is from a business school, and there was, and I got really interested in organizational design and organizational structures. And I remember like one of my first years teaching that class, trying to like talk about organizational structure. Some of the students, so these are like Stanford engineering master's students, and they felt like the organizational design, organizational structure literature was really out of date. Like I was teaching like knowledge management and stuff like that compared to what they were thinking about. So I updated it over the years. This is like 10 years ago. So I added things on like crowdsourcing platforms, like Open Innovation. So it was very like boundary of the firm. It was very like theory of the firm. How does technology sort of change those theories? But it's interesting because those lectures don't resonate as much. Like that's not really what's on people's minds. So I like redid the class and I added, so then maybe like 3 years later, 4 years later, I added a lot of the research about machine learning, because that's like what industry, at least over at Stanford, like that's what industry was like sort of interested in. So like the master's students were really interested in like machine learning, and like a lot of the literature, like you can still read it through a lens of like organizational structure, because it's like the relationship between the developers and the domain experts is like that's a very organizational structure kind of question. So I added a lot of stuff on machine learning like 4 years ago, like 4 years later. And then but I was a very updated, and then like I went on sabbatical, and then all people wanted to talk about was generative AI, like when I came back. And so like my class, which was like very like up to date with like all the machine learning in business and like all of that, was like suddenly out of date. So then I added a bunch of stuff on generative AI although there was still like, there's not a lot to teach, which is maybe like, is to the question of like, is this the MapQuest moment? So mostly like what I do is I just have students do a lot of research on how companies are using generative AI, rather than like teaching them how it's working, because I don't know. I think we're all kind of like studying it and constructing it at this moment. So that feels to me like the evolution that I've seen in a focus on organizational design, and then like technologies that are changing it over time.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you really landing it in what do master students want to know, because that's often what is top of mind. So I appreciate, and also I'm sorry that you have to change your class so much, and imagine that you'll have to keep changing it forever.
I mean, the audacity of teaching like the future of like what an idea.
What an idea. What an idea. Maybe you won't have to teach it in the future. You just get something else to teach it for you. Rebecca, I'm curious, in Asana, you've been at Asana since the newer ChatGPT, the more powerful generative AI has come out. What kind of things have you seen? How have you seen the questions being asked changed, if at all, or are they similar to what they were when you arrived?
I think we've definitely seen changes and across the board
Yeah.
in knowledge workers in general. And one of the interesting changes we've seen is in the beginning, we very much saw concerns, at least when you're looking at the average employee within an organization, we saw those concerns very much fixate on how AI was going to impact their direct personal experiences. So we did see a lot of fear. We saw fears around being perceived as lazy for using the technology, feeling like a fraud for using the technology, not knowing how to understand the technology or learn how to use the technology. And those concerns are still there for a decent minority of the knowledge worker population, but we've very much seen a shift in terms of concerns focused more on organizational concerns or societal concerns. So does the generative AI inject bias? Is it compromising my personal privacy, personal safety? And so I think that's a really interesting transition that we definitely see. And it makes sense as workers have learned to use the technology, they've learned, what the technology can do, but also what it can't do, and learned how they uniquely can interact with the technology and some of the uniquely human skills that are gonna, withstand some of these changes that we're seeing associated with generative AI. So in many ways, I think that's a positive shift. And across the board, we see as people are using AI, the ones that are using generative AI in particular daily are having different experiences than those who are just dabbling in the technology and using it monthly or even using it quarterly. They're much more able to understand not only the strengths of the technology, but also the weaknesses, and start to uncover new use cases that might not be directly relevant to their role on paper, but are enhancing their overall experience as employees today. And so I think that usage is really important, and leaning into the technology as a core part of your job, and recognizing not only the strengths but also the weaknesses.
Thanks, Rebecca. Can you offer a specific example? And I'm going to ask Melissa and Brent this as well of a unusual and surprising use you've seen people engage with the technology. Something that,
So
yeah.
we look a lot at the most common use cases and how those use
Mhm.
cases are changing. And one that has come to the top of the list, within the top 5 or 6 use cases is ideation and brainstorming.
Mhm.
And I'm hearing that more and more in terms of I was just on a webinar with the head of AI labs at Netscope, and he was talking about how his organization, or he hopes in the future his organization will start to incorporate generative AI in the very early stages of, say, hackathons or brainstorming. And as we all know, there's a lot of research to show that doing brainstorming independently in the beginning has a lot of benefit as opposed to doing it collectively. And I think generative AI has a lot of potential to help us overcome some of that blank page effect that can hinder ideation and content development, but at the same time, potentially minimize some of the biases that we see associated with collective brainstorming, like groupthink and different biases that do feed into that group setting.
Thank you, Rebecca. Melissa, did your students uncover any surprising uses that you can share?
I mean, I can give you like a cocktail party one, but I actually have one that I want to tell you about. So the cocktail party one is just so one of my guest speakers, his son had like created an agent that like helped him study for the AP history test, which I thought was cool. But the one that I based on like my interest, I just am dying to talk to somebody about. So I'm going to say this to the crowd and see if anyone wants to talk to me about this. So Jerry Davis often talks about how he has like such a great talk. Jerry Davis is a professor at Michigan, and he talks about he has this like funny joke where he talks about the like not at all sophisticated technology that automated like a large company, and his joke is like that it's the API basically, like an API, which is just like a line of code that connects the like front end and the back end of like a website. So he talks about how the API plays this like coordination function for organizations, and organizations currently are smaller than they used to be because we have like APIs that like connect different functions in an organization. So, and I have myself like kind of like when I'm presenting on Flash teams, I'll use like a phrase of like API to labor sometimes. Anyways, there's a lot of discussion of how APIs connect different resources. So they play this like coordination function. So having like talked about that with Jerry, having like used that phrase myself, there was like a moment where I saw somebody like go to ChatGPT and be like, write an API to Twitter. And I was like, oh, I was like, wait. So like using generative AI to create the APIs, like that was an interesting moment for me. And then I met a startup founder who had a company where basically he had a lot of software engineers who were writing APIs that were connecting different apps together. So he had this whole ecosystem where the developers were writing the APIs that connected everything. And so he was very struck by the fact that you could like write an API now using this technology. So anyway, I think that's like a generative idea. I haven't seen anything like in enterprise production at present, but I just think that's like a really interesting thing to think about.
Thanks, Melissa. Brent, any unusual examples or you want to share?
Sorry, one thing my team does is actually we're responsible for building up some of the initial Bing log analyses tools. So we got a chance to see, how folks were very early on, how folks were using the tool to, in many aspects of their lives. I can drop a link into chat, and Jeremy, maybe you can echo it. Published a series of papers recently to see the outcome of some of those explorations. But I'll do a cocktail party one and then a more substantive one too. Cocktail party one actually comes from a colleague who also, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. So he and I have our 3-year-olds are basically the same age. So he was saying he was using Microsoft Designer, which has a DALL-E 3 backend, to create coloring book pages on demand for his 3-year-old. Like, oh yeah, coloring book page of, whatever you want, like 5 unicorns, 7 mermaids, these types of things. And with all, my daughter reads some deer, maybe some foxes in there. So you can get that and sort of get it also a good sense of sort of parent how different the world's going to be for them, in some ways. The more substantive point, or I guess that the more practical points. One thing I like to see is that people certainly, or one area of utility of these tools I think is underexplored and has tremendously high potential is either you can think about it as the AI as coach or AI as provocateur. Have someone come in and like, what are some good critiques here? What would a person who believes this say about this document that I've written? It's really, Jaron Lanier is my colleague here at Microsoft, wrote a New Yorker piece basically saying like, these are crowdsourcing tools, these big AI models. They bring in all the knowledge from the internet and represent that on demand. They're very, very, very low latency crowdsourcing tools, and that to me resonates with this notion. It's like, oh, you can ask for the opinion of any sort of group of people about a document you might have to beta test it, or this notion of, and it was hopefully not anymore, but historically, sometimes with grad students, professors would have like a mean question practice session before a conference in case they would get a mean question. So you can begin to do that at scale a bit more. Throw in your deck into PowerPoint Copilot, say like, what would a scientist who thinks X, Y, or Z say about this deck, that type of thing. So I'm pretty excited about that as a productivity enhancer.
Thanks, Brent. And I would be remiss if I didn't call out that one of my students, Evie Huang, is working exactly in this space of thinking about AI as coach. And
Cool.
There's some really interesting things that are coming up in terms of it's not just informational, it's also there's an emotional component as well that coaches, as we all know. Rebecca, you were on sports teams. It's not just the plays you make, but how you're feeling about the plays and then what the next play is after that, which is very interesting. So
I think that's so fascinating. And when Melissa and I have looked a little bit at the research on like the use of metaphors and sense making and organizations, and the metaphors we use around technology is just so fascinating. We're looking at as well whether people see generative AI as a tool or a teammate, and seeing that those different usages of metaphors are associated with different levels of productivity associated with the use of generative AI, different levels of confidence and fear associated with the technology. And it's really powerful to think that the language around the technology matters so much. And I've even seen organizations discourage the use of the phrase artificial intelligence because it does convey this sense of, unhuman-like, and replace it with phrases like amplified intelligence or augmented intelligence, something that really positions the human in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Well, and I think Microsoft's a great example of the Copilot product, right? It was smartly named in that way. I'm sure plenty of research went into that. So actually going a little deeper into this, I'm curious how, well, we've talked about a lot of the positives. We'd be remiss without talking about diving a little more into the negatives. I've heard some things around de-skilling is one challenge. My daughter can't look up a word in a dictionary to save her life. What are you all seeing in terms of de-skilling, and what do we need? What kind of systems do we need to, or how should we be thinking about de-skilling and skilling the future of workers?
One of the things we see across the board that I think is pretty important are the disconnects between how executives are thinking about AI and how individual contributors are. And when we ask executives, not only, whether you feel you have the resources to learn generative AI, but also do you offer your organization those resources and learning and development, they're much more likely to say yes than the individual contributors. And so it's not only a resource gap, it's a perception gap that I think is pretty important in terms of making sure that your employees know that resources do exist, or if they're more likely to exist at the highest levels, equaling the playing field and investing in educating your entire workforce. Because we also see that when employees say that their organizations provide learning and development around the technology, they're not only more confident in their use of the technology, they're also more optimistic and have a brighter perception of the technology. And so I think the upskilling and reskilling is really important. And it's shocking how few companies across the board have yet to start to develop some of those resources in a systematic way. I think we just ran a study that found that 4%, I think, of organizations offer any sort of certification program around AI to their workforce. And it's staggering to think that, especially among companies that are investing heavily and advocating for the technology, they're not backing that up with resources that will help their employees succeed alongside the technology.
That 4% number is low, does feel low. And also the striking difference between what managers think or what they're offering versus perceptions of what are being offered. That seems to perhaps hold true across a lot of different kind of training and education. Melissa, Brent, any thoughts there?
Go ahead, Melissa.
All right, I'll say, so I think I was mentioning at the beginning, one of my studies is of domain experts who developed new skills. And the study looks at some of the design practices of the data scientists who are accomplishing that. And I think what I found really fascinating about that study is a lot of the kind of early decisions that the data scientists were making about how they were like framing the algorithm that they were developing mattered for what they built and how they interacted with the domain experts. And in some ways that's obvious, but at the same time, like going through the review process with the paper, like mostly the reviewers were like, this is too positive. This is too positive of an outcome. Like, I think like, they were like, why these data scientists sound like incredibly like empathetic. Why are these data scientists being such great citizens of the organization? I don't think that I've found it to be as rare as it seems like the reviewers are saying. So I feel like in some ways I'm saying something obvious to like human computer interaction audience, like, y'all, like if you frame for augmenting your users, you understand their needs deeply, you frame for the capabilities that they'll be able to develop based on the technology you're designing, then you will accomplish reskilling. In the organizational theory literature, that is a rare case that we found of them being of these experts leading to reskilling. I think so. That's just like a comment on human computer interaction and just like sort of design. Something that as we've been looking at generative AI, so that was a more like I think it was an optimization algorithm. So in this case, so in the generative AI studies, the thing that has been interesting to me is like a challenge that the users have often is figuring out the workflow wherein the generative AI is actually valuable and actually provides an unlock. And so in a lot of the cases that I'm thinking of, like students were like teaching actually their parents, who in many cases were knowledge workers, like a real estate agent, for example, how to use generative AI. And it took the parents like weeks to actually figure it out. But when they unlocked it, when they finally figured out like what was a workflow wherein it could be useful, then the unlock was like it was pretty substantial. Like as an example, it was like scraping Zillow, extracting features, pushing it to a website. And like that was actually pretty, so like the real estate agent who learned how to do that, like that was actually value enhancing for her. And I like when you hear that example, I'm not like she was de-skilled. It was like that was pretty cool that she learned how to do that. I wonder what else she's going to do with her time. So anyway, that's a lot. So I don't know, Brent, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I think Liz, as we get into sort of, I presume some of the potential negative impacts discussion, like, I think it's incumbent on all of us, academia and in industry, to be thinking about those all the time. These are powerful tools that if I'm not, deeply wrestling with the potential negative impacts again on a daily basis, I think that's irresponsible. It's important for, I would say, everyone working in the ecosystem, to do that. I think the de-skilling risk is real. I think there's a lot that we can do about it, and the question is, will we do something about it? Broadly speaking, what does success look like there? I mentioned this example of giving up some spatial rotation capability, and distributing that cognition to a phone. If we can get most people, the vast majority of people, feeling like they made a good deal there, or they're not being able to look up something in the dictionary for the ability to do amazing Zillow things quickly, that's a good deal. If people find themselves not on the right side of that equation, it's a large group of people, I think we'll all have lots of problems.
So how do I could go so deep into that. How do we make that happen as a society? I mean, I understand that we need to do it, but we also have these industry powers and a capitalist society, and I'm curious how we think about this. How you think that's going to happen?
Yeah, coming to Microsoft, I had a bet on a theory of change. I can let you know in 15 years, how it goes. But which is that I in my responsible AI presentations, within the company, sometimes outside of it, I have a really simple slide that's like makes me embarrassed how simple it is, but it'd be really useful for discussion. Venn diagram, 2 circles, good for the world, good for Microsoft. There's an overlap. I say, here at Microsoft, we're not well positioned. My academic colleagues, you folks are really well positioned to do stuff that is not good for Microsoft, but good for the world. And you should be leaning into that that's your incentive structure, right? Our incentive structure is to do stuff that's good for Microsoft, but there is that overlap and our expectation of ourselves within the folks who are, I would not say thinking about responsible AI, thinking about the long-term health of the company. That's why responsible AI is important. Our expectation of ourselves should be to maximize the extent to which we take advantage of every big opportunity in the intersection, right? Versus distracting ourselves with stuff that our academic colleagues are more effective at targeting. For instance, with the content supply chains, content ecosystem stuff, I'm incredibly optimistic that there are ways that a company, could be Microsoft, could be another company, could be a set of companies, can shift the market such that because of the nature of the way these technologies work and the policy and legal environment and these types of things, and shift the market such that it's clear that there's a market advantage to having a generative AI ecosystem that distributes its profits to a much wider group of people. It grows the pie massively, so everyone gets a bigger slice, including the content creators, even if it's a higher percentage than maybe a different paradigm. So that's one example. And another really good example is that first misconception I talked about, which is like the best use of people think that the first. Eric Brynjolfsson has this article that captures, I think, in Melissa, where you're talking about with framing things being obvious but important. I couldn't agree more. Like, it's so important to understand these sort of core principles. And Eric Brynjolfsson captured something that it wrote up well. Something that's concerned me for years and years and years, which is there's a cultural tendency within computing to think about the best uses of computing as substitutional use cases. I see this process, I would like to automate it, right? Versus pushing towards new capabilities, right? And that instinct is actually, on the whole, something that Microsoft is ultimately a company that helps other businesses in many ways. That's a core part of our business. If all of our businesses did that, that would be really bad news, not only for those businesses, but for the economy. We need people to produce more output, not just reduce the number of inputs it takes to produce the same amount of output. And that's good for our business. Like, the more money our customers make, the more money Microsoft can make, right? So that's another example of something that's at the intersection. So that's where my optimism comes from, is that there are things in these big companies' incentive structures that can be really good for a much wider set of stakeholders too.
Rebecca, I have to ask you, as somebody who works at Asana, do you have a point of view on this, or a thought about how companies are going to responsibly develop AI and the incentive structures for doing so?
Yeah, it's so important. And I think that a big first step is to develop a set of core principles and values around AI. That's something that we did very early at Asana, is we put together a list of what we believe should be true about AI and how we approach AI. And how humans should be in the decision-making seat as we build human plus AI teams. And a lot of companies haven't gone that far. And I think when it comes to employees and how they're interpreting the technology, knowing the intention and why behind it really matters. We saw this with some of our research on hybrid and remote work as well, where, the effectiveness of a policy in the eyes of employees is so driven by whether the employer has communicated the why and the purpose behind the policy. And I think it's similar with AI, where you can help your organization not only understand the technology, but understand how to use it in a responsible, ethical, thoughtful, strategic way when you at the onset develop these principles and these guiding lights for your employees to anchor on, even as the technology changes. Presumably those principles and philosophy around the technology shouldn't change.
Thank you.
Liz, can I add one?
Of course. Yeah,
quick response
please.
to that? Yeah, so just building on what everyone has said, so it's making me think of the work of one of our PhD students, Nick Okafor. So he does research on responsible innovation, and he also leads a nonprofit called Trouble. And they look at how to introduce like critical consciousness into STEM education. So STEM education sort of is like the upstream of how we end up with technologists and like innovators who are going to be doing these framing exercises and be doing these values exercises. So I think what's really cool about his nonprofit and with a bunch of the folks that he works with is they look at how to introduce specifically like how to teach critical consciousness in STEM education. So they have research where they're looking at whether students are able, feel more aware of societal and ethical implications, feel more aware of, and like sort of interventions that can happen around technology. They draw on like abolitionist and liberatory frameworks to sort of help people think more critically, help students think more critically about their STEM education. So I think some of the stuff that they're doing might, be sort of like this upstream help for the kind of framing and like values that Rebecca and Brent were talking about.
That's great, Melissa. I'm glad you went all the way back to the beginning. And now that people like Brent have 1 and 3-year-olds, you can practice in the nursery school realm, figure out what that would look like. I think that's really important. I mean, kids are younger and younger being introduced to this, but not necessarily the critical consciousness. So that's a great point. Thank you. At this point, I'm going to encourage, some folks have been putting their questions in the Q&A. Again, we'll try and get through as many as possible. But before we go there, I want to turn to our guests. I have one last question, but before I ask it, I'm curious if you have questions for each other that you've been dying to ask, or and want to challenge anybody on anything.
I
Can we
wanted to
predict the
nerd out
future?
with you both. Nerd out with you both on some things. Like actually, like just this last point of like the cultural stuff. I can't say how important that is. I mean, I maybe in the question form, Melissa, Rebecca, I'm not sure if you folks have seen some of the survey data coming out of folks surveying the AI community and how much potential there is right now for community of practice based set of actions that could potentially create some useful norms for the industry. There's surveyed like huge percentages of people are just deeply uncomfortable with some things that are going on, this just strikes me as a tremendous opportunity right now for that type of education, including later in life, I would say.
I agree. And one thing we see that we haven't touched on yet today is just the differences geographically that we see in terms of AI adoption. And in Europe, it's very different than it is in Japan, than it is. I was in Australia a couple of months ago, and the climates are all different. And I think some of these community practices can be very valuable as we think about sharing across cultures as well.
Can you give an example of how they're different, Rebecca? Something you saw once you clear your throat?
Sorry,
I'm really glad you brought
Works
it up.
councils. I'll bet Rebecca will answer with works councils.
with that, it's very different. It's not all the same. We often take I often falsely take a American centric point of view. It's very different. It's also true that not everybody has access to AI technology, right? This is still not pervasive, and being aware that there are many different ways and community of practices in the world is very important. But I'd love to hear, yeah, is there a particular difference that you can speak to in Australia or Asia, wherever you've been traveling?
Yeah, I think that the use cases are quite different in terms of what folks are seeing AI being applied towards. In Australia, for example, meetings are a pervasive problem, way more than they are in the US even. And so thinking about the applications of AI for meetings is more salient over there. The privacy as well. In Europe, there are different privacy regulations, and that is always top of mind when we talk with those executives and customers as well, in terms of what's top of mind for AI. Privacy and security is always leading the conversation, whereas in the US, I find it's a second conversation, not necessarily the first conversation.
Thank you. Any other questions for each other before I ask my final question and then add to? Excellent. Okay. So my question is, where are we going in the future? What are areas that each of you see that researchers and research practitioners are not touching on, that we really need to do more, areas we need to do more work in?
So do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll say something that I'm interested in and thinking about is I heard it sort of explained as we were in a moment of a lot of like hype and experimentation around generative AI, and I'm very curious what it will be like when it's actually like implemented in a different way in companies. It's like the accuracy issues seem so important, and I've just seen like so many examples in the last months. I feel like the conversation has shifted, is maybe what I would say. I've seen a lot of examples in the last month where people are just kind of dismayed at a lot of the like accuracy problems that are coming out. Doesn't mean they can't be, it doesn't mean that they won't be sort of like improvised. People won't like respond to it. But it seems like for this to be a technology that is in regular use in companies in the way that people were predicting in like 2023, it seems like those accuracy issues are going to, I'm curious to see how people work with those.
Boy, I say, where do I start on this one? There's so many questions that I think don't have good answers right now. One thing I should put a plug out for the academics in the audience. We're going to soon be doing our, I think, what has become at least somewhat annual call for proposals on with not as much money as I would dream, but a decent amount of money to support work on some of these and many other questions too that should be coming out shortly. I can drop the link here for it to be passed around where you would see it. But what's very top of mind is we have this really big problem with how these systems are, their relationship to the content on which they depend. We have our 5 models at Microsoft, which are these incredible small language models that perform outstandingly well. Folks can read about the recent news about Phi 3, and the core insight behind Phi is that training, that's important, but like not super fancy. GPUs, they're okay. What you really want is high quality data, and that strikes me as that's a sort of a very, very, very important insight in terms of the future of these technologies, and the companies and the researchers that find ways to maximize the availability of that high quality data in a perpetual fashion will have a significant advantage. That's, to me, is extraordinarily top of mind. To build on what Melissa said too, I think like we can learn a lot from prior work and can do a lot more work in what I would call appropriate reliance, knowing when to rely on these technologies when people don't currently, and knowing when not to rely on these technologies when perhaps they do. And there's a lot of really interesting full stack research, like from the model all the way up to the human, that I think can happen there that I'm pretty excited about.
Thanks, Brent. Rebecca, any
I think
areas?
Yeah, I think what Brent alluded to is really powerful in terms of the dialogue and interaction between industry and academia. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about is bridging that divide. And we know that there's so much great academic research going back, years and decades that has tremendous applicability today when we're thinking about rolling out AI and doing so in a way that's thoughtful and effective. And I hope there is more dialogue in the future and collaboration between those two different worlds and working together to figure out how do we roll out this technology in a way that, is beneficial to organizations, or at minimum, how do we better share learnings in terms of the likely impact of some of these technologies on the ways in which we work.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm so glad we're all talking together. This is exactly what we wanted to do, bring together industry, researchers, academics, etc. So now I'm going to switch to, we have some great questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. And one person asked a great question around how we individuals, people react to AI failures when they don't produce the results they want. So this person was asking regarding the study you were mentioning, Melissa, around annotating in the medical context, but I think anybody could answer this. Did some people view this as a broader structural organization issue? For example, oh, AI should just not be used for this task. Or did some people view this as a technical issue? Oh, the AI just needs to be fixed or changed. And how do you think about those two perspectives? Anybody can answer, but this was referencing the work you were talking about, Melissa.
It's a great question. It's a great way of kind of framing a way to think about what was going on there. I have both like the specific answer and then sort of like a more general thought about it. In this particular case, the AI not working was seen as a sort of like I don't want to say a technical failure. It was basically like they couldn't configure the computer vision model to work with the existing taxonomy. So it was like a socio-technical failure, I think. And I feel like pretty quickly they were able to figure out what they could actually detect with computer vision compared to what they could not detect with computer vision. And the complication was that what they could detect was not immediately obviously relevant to doctors. And what they couldn't detect is what the doctors had actually wanted to have detected. So there ended up being an interesting interplay between the like expertise of the domain experts and the expertise of the developers as they sort of like made that shift. I think though that I think you have an interesting frame here because I think that oftentimes users are like encountering behavior from any of these kinds of tools that they're not expecting that they have to make sense of. And I think I've seen different what I want to think more about, having like read your question now, is like the conditions under which people end up viewing it as organizational, structural, technical, or like a reskilling. The most successful transformation, where I'm just imagining that like the users ended up learning something that they really valued. They treated it more as like an education opportunity where the users, it was a pretty advanced like data set and a pretty advanced like algorithm that they ended up using, and they treated it as more of like a reskilling effort. So it seems like there's like different responses, and it's interesting to think about the conditions under which you're going to see the problems or the like unexpected behavior kind of framed in different ways like that.
Thanks, Melissa. Brent, Rebecca?
I'm recalling like like Melissa, I would agree that like I wouldn't say socio or technical, right? In any problem, you can find social solutions or you can find technical solutions or some combination of the two, right? And I have an example, so I have to be careful here, but I will say that there was a team at Microsoft that did some internal tooling that was 94% accurate at asking questions of data. Something that way, right? So that's great. Still 6%. So what do? Well, they have a special flag in that tool that if an executive uses it, they have someone who double checks it. So it's a socio-technical solution. Like the executives in theory, if they're using that data, they're going to be higher leverage on average, right, than someone who's lower level. So like that's a good use I think to me, it's just a good use of a socio-technical system to solve a socio-technical problem.
Thank you for sharing that specific story, but in an abstract way. Rebecca, any in the best. I mean, the specifics are great. Rebecca, anything to
I love that story. I what we see, and I think there's other research to show this too, is so many workers right now, when they prompt the AI and they don't receive what they expect to receive back, they stop after one or two tries. And I think that mindset around experimentation and learning, growth mindset, and knowing that the first response might not be the right one, but continuing to test and learn with the technology is really important. And I think fostering that type of environment can help, remove some of the negatives associated with these initial responses toward AI into a real learning and growth opportunity.
I love that, Rebecca. Yeah, if the first time doesn't, you have to try it a couple times. I appreciate that. I see that with my students sometimes, like, well, it didn't work. Well, okay, let's try it again. That's true of most things in life. So the next question is, we talked a bit about ethics and AI deployment, but this is an interesting different angle around ethics and AI development. And so I'll read the question directly. The person asks, with the AI augmentation of work practices and processes and the assumption of efficiency gains and human productivity gains, how is it ethical to proceed with development in a context where the generative AI tools are not widely accessible and in many ways bolster those already in positions of power?
This one I can take a stab at, just because it's something I think about decently often. So that is a force that's in play, but these technologies have a opposing force that's also very, very powerful. And that is that they appear to be, by their very nature, right, capture expertise that's written down and make it more accessible. And so you have all these lab studies that show that someone who has experience, the value of experience relative value of experience goes down. And there's some interesting aspects here, but there's definitely a force, in this direction relative to without these technologies. So someone, for instance, who's writing, a blog post, company press release, right? A person who doesn't know how to write a press release is just much more effective with these tools for pretty obvious reasons. Then, like gets closer to, expert level performance. And so that is a huge force pushing the opposite direction. So even if you have a subpar system and it's accessible, and these language models are working on device now, mobile phones, these types of things, it's a subpar thing, and you get access to that, you'll gain a lot of the expertise that you don't have, and maybe we're prevented from getting. And so like everything in this domain, super complex, but we do have that countervailing force, and that's not the case for previous generations of technologies. They generally made education and those types of things much, much more valuable. They differentially benefited people with that training. So this is new in the technology world, relatively.
I would love to give a response also. So this question came from Darren, who I have met before. So hello, thanks for the great question. I think what's so interesting to me about this question, the question is like, how is it ethical? And I think what this is prompting for me is like our culture at present is so comfortable with the idea of like unequal productivity gains through technology. Our culture is, so it is like ethical only because our culture is so comfortable with that. The reason that I'm like excited about this question and like talking about it that way, I went to a talk at Stanford GSB yesterday. Allison Pugh, who is a sociologist, who wrote a book called, I think, The Last Human Job. And her book is about the like automation and systemization of connective labor. So like therapists, for example, teachers, therapists, things like that. She goes deep into the definition of it. I'm not doing it justice. But I had dinner with her after, and we were sort of like talking about what she learned from that research. And she was saying that what she learned from this and what she hopes is that there's like, that people will stop asking the question of whether like generative AI will be like good enough for therapy clients. And she was like, it's not good for therapists. And our culture does not ever ask the question, like, what does not take into account the impact on educators, therapists, or whatever. That our culture does not have that frame at present. So her asking that people look to the impact on the workers or on the like connective labor providers, therapists in this example, her saying we should think about that, that should be part of our like stakeholder analysis. When she was saying this to me, I was like, that idea does not exist in the culture at present. I was like, you're trying to say the culture should change, the culture needs to change and like look at this differently. And she was like, yeah, I guess that's true. I guess I'm asking for like a culture change. So I think that's my response is like, how is it ethical? It's only ethical because our culture is so comfortable with it. Like, should our culture change? Should our culture get less comfortable with this like unequal productivity gains? That is a cultural innovation that we could try to introduce, for example.
Thank you, Melissa. Rebecca, anything to add there?
I think one thing we know as well is that productivity gains, there'll be commonalities in terms of industries or job function, but really so much is dependent on the organizational context. And I think that this really presents an opportunity and a responsibility to measure those impacts across your workforce. And it's going to affect different people differently in terms of a lot of different demographics and firmographics and the nature of your work. And I think we do have a responsibility to understand the impact of these technologies and start to measure and use data to then present the evidence. I think we can always tell stories about different people being more productive, but the more we can anchor in data and share that and increase awareness, I think that's a big part of the solution here as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have questions, two questions related that are kind of building on what we've said. So I'll add them and then see if you have anything else to add to this, which is one of our listeners asked, how do you foresee AI impacting industries that traditionally haven't heavily relied on technology? They give the example of agriculture. And then the other example was around how do we think about technology in spaces that are not tech. Oh, here. Do you think generative AI can support positions that have very little to do with technology right now, that aren't even necessarily thinking about technology? And how should we think about that? I've heard one suggestion from Melissa, which is let's build a broader stakeholder map, and stakeholders are supposed to include not just the people who would benefit, but also people who could potentially be hurt by something. But I'm curious how you thought about this, if you want to add any additional thoughts.
I think a lot of it also, it depends on how people adopt the technology and whether they adopt. And we definitely see that some of these industries that haven't relied traditionally as heavily on technology are much slower to adopt AI. And I think the question of whether they adopt and then use is an important one. And once they adopt, then I think that the transformational potential is vast, potentially even more so because they haven't had those gains from automation previously. But I think that adoption is going to be key to determining exactly what the potential gains are.
I can add a bit here. I think like one thing I can say is, if you look at like where productivity is lagging in the economy. Sorry, everyone froze there for a second. It's like, oh no, but we're back. Productivity is lagging in the economy. Like traditionally, you think of industries like medicine or education, like it's sort of the most the pushback. Construction is a great example of somewhere that is really bad. So like there's some research that suggests that the average construction worker is less productive than they were in the 1950s. And we see that in our built environment where, like, I'd say within responsible AI context, like if you tried to, let's take Chicago as an example, right? Let's say you want to build like, I don't know, a new bridge on Northwestern's campus even. Years of reviews that take forever to go through, all sorts of efficiency you can add there. whole bunch of building technologies that haven't been deployed, in these types of things. And here we are, Microsoft, or our colleagues over at OpenAI make just these. They're just moving super quickly, making changes that have a much larger stakeholder set, affected. I'd be very. I think it's, there's an argument that some of the lowest hanging fruits and most exciting things might come out of industries like construction, where you might have, for instance, environmental reviews that could go a lot faster, and even more of them, so we can do even better environmental reviews, over time, just to sort of massively increase our ability to change our built environment to, trivially speaking, increase the housing stock, stuff like that. So I'm actually, my answer is kind of like, I'm just like really excited about the potential there. Agriculture is a little different, because agriculture actually is a really huge success story for society on the technology front, just not as much the current wave.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really changing agriculture. Melissa, any thoughts?
Well, I feel like my unhelpful response is, I was like, is that true? I was like, is agriculture not using technology?
Yeah.
I'm like,
Well, sounds
sure.
like,
yeah,
no, they are. They're using it exceptionally.
About like the research method that I use of being an ethnographer is it makes me really question like anything that's like low skill or low technology. I'm like, I'm not sure that's true. Like anytime I've gone into a workplace, I just think there's like so much expertise and so much technology that people end up like innovating and using. So,
and I don't know that there's a low skill job, really. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
I agree with you fundamentally. There's a lot of skill. It's just how our culture has valued it historically, would be my take on that. Okay, we're gonna, two more things before we end. We're gonna ask about hallucinations, because that's something we haven't hit on yet. We're talking about AI hallucinations in this case, and curious what you think about how these will be accepted in corporate, or what extent of AI hallucinations will be accepted in corporate culture. And is there going to be an acceptable margin? I'm going to give you a either or. You can answer that question, or my other question is a little different. If you were to have a bumper sticker on the back of your car that said something about AI, what would it say? So bumper stickers, just to remind you, just have a few words in them. They can also have symbols, but just to remind you, that's what a bumper sticker is. So
an
either
academic bumper sticker has a whole abstract on it.
No essays, a few words. So you either get to answer, this will be our closeout, with a bumper sticker, or if you want to speak about hallucinations. Hard to choose.
Bumper sticker?
I'll go, because I'm gonna do hallucinations, and I have like, I again have like a completely unhelpful take on this, like completely unhelpful. This is like my current like rage against like, sorry, there's a joke that a co-author and I have about like rage-based research, just like when something starts to like really just get under your skin. So I think that the word hallucination is not doing us favors. I wish that we were like generative AI errors. I wish we just called them errors instead of hallucinations.
Say
I
more.
Say that all
say
the
more.
time at Microsoft. The exact same thing. It's
Oh,
not
really?
anything different than it's an error of precision. We know these.
It's an error. Yeah. When people say hallucinations, it sounds whimsical, and it also sounds like something that you could just like help it not be high, like help it like not be on drugs, and then it won't be hallucinating anymore. Instead of that, these models fundamentally produce errors, and we need to know that and be very ready for the errors. Unhelpful take. It was a great question.
No, that's your bumper sticker. Errors, not hallucinations. I saw it. Right, you did both. 2 in 1. Thank you, Melissa. Rebecca, bumper sticker or errors?
Well, I'll build on that. I think that, hallucination, or the better term of error, should be just part of the skill development and training and learning and development around AI. It needs to be, part of the training. Just as we learn to prompt engineer, we learn to understand where errors are likely to occur and how to make judgment calls in terms of whether they're likely to be errors or not. And I think that should be a core part of the overall learning and development around the technology.
Thank you, Becca.
And then my bumper sticker is, we make the future of work. It's in our control. And we have all sorts of levers to, we make future work, pull over and we can have a nice conversation. We make we have all sorts of levers that we can pull. And so there's no sense of feeling out of control. But there's a moment, it is a moment of importance and urgency. So it is important that we seize that moment.
We make the future of work. I love that. Mine is I root for teams. I think that is how we're going to figure this out. It's going to be teams of people. They're going to be technologically supported. We're going to have AI as teammates, just as we've had technology support us in the past. But I agree with you. If we want to build the future, we've got to build it. Like, let's not let it happen to us. So I couldn't agree more with you. Thank you all so much. You're all very busy people. Melissa, Brent, and Rebecca, couldn't thank you enough. Again, thanks to Morgan and Jeremy on the back end for making this happen. Thank you all those who tuned in on an afternoon or morning, wherever time zone you are. We really are enjoying these HCI conversations and thought leader dialogues with brilliant people from throughout the world. And we expect to have another one on May 23rd. It's around decentralizing social media. So please check back on our website, hci.northwestern.edu, if you want to check and hear more about that. So again, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure, and errors, not hallucinations. I'm taking that away. I want to use that for myself as well. Thank you all so much. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.